Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. Today we're going to be taking a break from Azure and looking at a recent project that I did on building a custom laptop. I was recently in the market for a new laptop and I wanted to make a video that documented this experience. I wanted to first start by outlining my needs. I work on a laptop pretty much all day, every day at work, and I am a IT professional, so I make heavy use of multitasking in a lot of different ways, and this is typically in productivity software such as Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel, Outlook, and a number of other apps that I use on my machine, and I use these apps simultaneously with one another. Likewise, I also do a lot of software development, oftentimes in multiple languages, so I'll have multiple IDEs open or multiple environments running at the same time. Also, I run several virtual machines. Oftentimes, I'll have multiple virtual machines with an IDE running either in the VM or on the host VM. So I will have a lot of development and virtual machines running on my machine simultaneously. I run a myriad of different operating systems in those VMs, such as Linux, Windows. I do Windows database development as Linux database development, and also do a fair amount of work with containers. And I also do video editing and screen recordings like this one I'm doing now, oftentimes while I'm doing VMs or development, because a lot of what I do with these video recordings and video editings has to do with the technology that I am running on my laptop. So all of these various things are coupled with photography that is somewhat of a hobby of mine, and lightweight gaming. I'm not a hardcore gamer, so I do occasionally game though, and most of the titles I run are generally fairly light, not the AAA titles, but I do like to play things like StarCraft and Diablo and other more modern games. Occasionally I'll try them out just to see what they're like, but lightweight gaming would be one of my needs. The sum total of all of these different requirements results in a machine that needs a great deal of RAM, because I often run virtual machines and IDEs and productivity software and all these kinds of things at the same time. They all get loaded into memory, so I have a need for more RAM than the typical user would have on his or her laptop. Also, I would need lots of fast storage. When you're writing code, one of the things that can bog down the compilation of code or even the running of code is a slow hard drive, because it uses a bunch of small files to compile that code into a larger binary format that would be distributed. Also, whenever you're doing database development, it helps to have fast storage too, because a lot of random reads and writes are happening in the context of databases. And the same would happen within the context of multiple VMs running on a machine, because they're constantly running things in the background to support that virtual machine that is running. So lots of RAM, lots of fast storage. To a lesser degree, I needed a decent GPU to handle some of the kinds of development I do. Some things with AI use GPUs, and to support a lightweight gaming platform, as well as some video editing and screen recording type stuff. And I also had a need for a decent GPU. Now, I'm not looking for a high-end, two-digit core kind of CPU, rather something that would work for what I do, which would typically be something in the iCore 7 range, which is what I've been targeting for most of my build anyway. And then I mentioned that it needs to be portable, because I do occasionally travel with my job, and I'd like to take the laptop that I primarily use for my work with me. And so I had to figure out how to cram all of this stuff into a laptop. Well, this presented me with three different ways of approaching this problem. I could have ordered a custom laptop, and the pros of this would be I would get exactly what I want. I would get out of the box a machine that had all of the requirements met, and that would be lots of RAM, lots of storage, decent CPU, decent GPU, and it would have been exactly what I need. The cons of doing it this way is typically a custom laptop from a customizer is more expensive. A second option that I've done in the past with my last build I did for my work laptop was get an OEM laptop and upgrade it. Now, when I looked at custom laptops before in the past, they typically were more expensive. So I said, well, I could just probably get an OEM laptop and swap out some of the components, and it would be cheaper than a custom laptop, but I would get in the end what I wanted in a laptop. And this approach worked well for me for the last 3 years because it's exactly what I did. But the downside to using these OEM laptops is they're typically harder to work on. So when I ordered my last laptop, which is an Asus, to replace one of the storage devices in it, I literally had to take the whole thing apart down to the motherboard, remove the top, remove the bottom, and just to remove the caddy for the optical drive, so I could put a caddy for a hard disk in there and put it back together. And that was a little bit arduous, so it was not exactly the easiest thing to work on. And the third option that presented me was, is it possible to build a laptop? Truthfully, it's not really building a laptop in the way that I would build a fully custom desktop, but in the same way that one could go about building a desktop, could it be done for a laptop? That is, just find some basic components that are already assembled in a basic form, like maybe a bare bones laptop, and then source some of the other components that I could put into it and then build it myself. And the advantages of this would be that I get exactly what I want at a price point that is better than a custom laptop. The downside of this is having to obtain the parts and build it myself. So this requires doing a lot of research into what are the best components, what's supported by what a laptop I might otherwise order, and then trying to find the right components and then put those into the laptop myself. So typically system builders do all that hard work for you so that when you buy something like a custom laptop or an OEM laptop, it performs well. But if you just select random components off of some website like Newegg or Amazon, they're not guaranteed to work well together. So you have to go do all that hard work yourself. So I actually ended up going with the third option on this build. And it really was not to say I built a full-blown laptop, but I wanted to document this to show you that it is possible to build more or less a custom laptop, and you can do it for less than a custom laptop, and it's really not that as hard as you might think. So, but a little bit of background on how the laptop industry works, and I've mentioned some things already, OEM laptops, and then there's another kind of laptops I am going to talk about. And OEMs are typically your HP, your Dell, MSI, Asus, Lenovo. These kinds of manufacturers will build a laptop, and what they start by doing is designing the product themselves. So they'll build design a motherboard and then print the motherboard and then design the casing for it and the power delivery for that. And then they'll actually build those components in whatever fab they have. They'll print the motherboard on a PCB, as it's a PCB, so a printed circuit board. They'll design the case that it goes in, the cooling system, and then the power delivery for that laptop. And then they build all those components themselves. And once those components are built, then they will source components that they themselves don't build. This would be things like RAM, storage, CPUs, GPUs, and so on. And then they'll also source the software for that laptop. So that would be your operating system and any other productivity software or additional software that would come with it. And once they have the parts they design themselves and the source components and software, they build the laptop. Now, with the laptop built, they can take that laptop and sell it by way of retail. And they would either do this by direct consumer retail, or they'll sell it through a channel like Amazon or Best Buy or something like that. Now, a smaller niche market is what we call ODM, or original design manufacturer. And one of the more prevalent manufacturers in this category would be a company called Clevo. And I really didn't even know who this company was until I started digging into how some manufacturers did laptops. And Clevo kept coming up in a lot of different searches, so I dug deeper to figure out what they were, and it turns out they're an original design manufacturer. And what they do is just like an OEM will design a product, that is, they design the motherboard, the chassis, and the power delivery and build it. So they build the actual PCBs, or maybe they outsource the PCB. They build the chassis it goes in and the power delivery for that. And once they have that built, what they do is they take that base model that they have designed, and it's a bare bones laptop essentially, and sell it to system builders. And system builders are guys that will take these bare bones laptops and then take them and actually build custom laptops from. And a couple of examples of this would be folks like Exotic PC, Sager, ProStar, and iPowerBuy. Now, they're not the big guys like HP, Dell, MSI, and Asus, but these guys specialize in building custom machines, and they do well in the desktop arena, and a lot of for a lot of these companies, that's kind of their main line of business. However, the need for custom laptops occasionally does arise, so they will source some bare bones laptops from a company like Clevo, and most of these actually use Clevo, and then they will source the components as well as the software, just like the OEM did, but they're not actually building and designing the motherboard, chassis, and power delivery. And they go through the process of finding the best components for a given system, and then they put that into a system and they actually build the laptop. And then once that is done, then they will sell that by way of retail, either direct consumer retail, or they will actually sell these on retail marketplaces like Amazon or through Newegg, or even in some cases maybe a retail outlet like Best Buy. So these are two different models that exist in the space of laptops. The question I had is, could I just take on the role of a system builder myself and do this? And I have ample experience repairing laptops. I've actually torn apart, dozens, maybe hundreds of laptops over my life, going back to the late 90s, and since then have repaired from scratch HP's, Dell's, MSI's, Asus, Lenovo, you name it. I've probably worked on it at some point. And even in some cases have torn them all the way down to where it was just nothing but the clamshell, because I had to replace something like a motherboard or something like that and then rebuilt it. And also I've actually done a custom build that I did about a year ago on another old laptop I had that originally had upgraded from a dual core that had 8 gigs of RAM to a quad core that had 16 gigs of RAM. Then in a second upgrade, I actually ordered a new motherboard for it, tore it all down again, and then the new motherboard had 4 RAM slots rather than 2, so it allowed me to double the RAM to 32 gigs of RAM, reuse that same CPU, and then I also added some storage to it, and now that is actually what I'm using for my hypervisor for ESXi. And so the ability to, more or less build a laptop is possible, but it's not like the traditional experience that you would have with a desktop. Now, when I say build a laptop, I'm not talking about going out from scratch and buying a case, power supply, and all that. Rather, it's more or less customizing a bare bones laptop. So what does that look like? What can you customize on a laptop? Typically, you can customize RAM, storage, and networking, which is fairly limited. Most laptops are going to have the ability to put into the laptop some level of RAM that you can swap out. So many laptops will only come with 1 DIMM, and maybe you can expand it to use 2 DIMMs. Some more high-end laptops will actually have 4 RAM slots that will allow you to have a much higher RAM capacity. A lot of times you can customize the storage on those. Like with most laptops, they just source it from a manufacturer of storage such as Samsung or Western Digital, and then with these storage devices you can put those into a laptop just like the OEM guys do. And then networking. By networking I'm talking about the wireless networking. Typically the Ethernet is built onto the motherboard, but the wireless networking is usually a component that you can add to the machine, and these can support Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, or Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and even sometimes cellular connectivity with LTE modems and things like that on a device, and you can plug those in and then use those different networking devices. To a lesser degree, sometimes you can customize the CPU and GPU on laptops. There used to be a spec for GPUs that allowed you to have a discrete GPU that was removable on laptops, but the standard never really took off. So to a lesser degree, GPUs sometimes can be changed out on laptops. Sometimes CPUs can too, depending on the laptop build. Typically, though, the laptop is built for a specific CPU in mind. However, sometimes a manufacturer will build a motherboard that will support multiple GPUs, and you can sometimes customize the GPU to a lesser extent than you could on a desktop. But sometimes you can, just like I mentioned a minute ago, I was able to replace a CPU on my old laptop from a dual core to a quad core, and it was able to support that CPU. And the things that you really can't customize on a laptop that aren't interchangeable is obviously the motherboard and the power supply and the chassis, because typically the motherboard is very specific to the chassis that it's going into. So the case that you're mounting that into and the motherboard really have to be joined at the hip in a lot of ways, because it's shaped and cut in a certain way to fit inside of a very small package. So they have to cut out big arcs for fans and cooling, and have very tight connections in there for power delivery and wiring channels and all that, just so you can get all that to fit into a laptop, which is not a simple task to do. And when you go down that route, it makes the power delivery for that very specific to that motherboard. So typically, the power supply is going to be proprietary or similar or somewhat proprietary to your laptop. Now, sometimes it is possible to use a generic power supply with just any given laptop. However, it's not always the case that that's possible. So with this in mind, I actually went about going down the route of customizing a laptop, and I sourced a Clevos bare bones laptop, and it ended up looking something like this. My build used a Clevo NH58R RDQ, and that was had with it in the chassis already a motherboard, GPU, and CPU. So this was one unit that I bought online for it was just a Clevo barebone laptop, and it had an i7 9th gen in it with 6 cores and 12 threads, with a 2.6 gigahertz base and a 4.5 gigahertz turbo. It had an NVIDIA RTX 2060 in it with 6 gigs of RAM, and that was the base that I worked with. And then I sourced some RAM, so I wanted 64 gigs of RAM to satisfy that lots of RAM requirement. So I got two Samsung DIMMs. These are 32 gig DIMMs of DDR4 at 66 megahertz or 2.6 gigahertz there. And then for storage, I wanted some fast storage, so I went with Samsung Evo 970 pluses, and I bought two of these to satisfy lots of fast storage. And these this particular laptop that I based this build on had two NVMe slots for storage on it. So these guys would give me a total of 4 terabytes of storage, and these are very fast drives too. They have good random read-write speeds on them, as well as contiguous writes and contiguous reads as well. And then for networking, I went with a simple Intel wireless adapter for 9260 there. It's a 2x2 AC, so it's MIMO. And then for my software, I went with the old software I had on my laptop and just moved it over to my latest build here. And so that allowed me to have a zero cost in my software, simply just moving the licenses over. To compare this to another build, I went out to one of the custom manufacturers for a laptop and inspected out a laptop that had very similar components. Actually, I think it still had the same base model that I was using, and I had no software on it, so there was no cost associated with software at all either. So it was just the hardware, and the price of that laptop came out to be about $2,800. I spent about $2,550 for a difference of $243. Now, I will say that the difference between that one I spec'd out and my build is that I couldn't find anybody selling the 970 pluses for storage, and so I just went with the closest thing, which would have been just a 970. And I imagine if I found a place that had the 970 pluses on it, it would cost more than what I ended up speccing out here. So even so, going with the 970 pluses and then doing it myself, I still came out way ahead, even though the closest spec I could find didn't even have those drives available, which are typically more expensive. So all in all, I've been very satisfied with this build because it was very straightforward and easy to do. So I'm going to show you exactly what the build looks like, and it didn't take me long at all. In total build time, maybe an hour, and then about 30 minutes to install Windows, and from there I was able to go from like literally opening the box to a machine with Windows installed on it in less than 2 hours. So here I have my laptop. It's just out of the box, and I'm turning it over to start disassembling it so I can start the build. First thing I'm going to do though is remove the battery, and that's easily done by simply doing some clips. Moving the clips out to put my screwdriver down. And once you have the battery out, you can remove some screws, and the screws come out. And once those screws come out, it's rather easy to remove the top. Simply do that just by taking that and popping it off, and it comes off rather easily. And once you have it off, you can see the motherboard exposed on the back. I'm going to put the RAM in now. You do that simply by lining up the keys and then popping those into place, and then just clip into place one on top of the other. Now once those RAM modules installed, you can either install the NIC or you can install the drives, which I'm going to do the drives first. And here I'm just taking the drives and sliding them in the slots for those, and then tightening them down with a single screw. I'm not using any kind of fancy screwdrivers. The Clevo build came with a set of screws to use exactly for this, and once I had the first one installed, I installed a second one, and those are the two NVMe 2 terabyte drives that I went with on this build, and they are rather easy to install in this particular model. But you can also put SATA on that big blank down there in the lower left side of the frame. Now once that's in, the hardest component to install is the wireless NIC, and that is because attaching the antennas to this guy is a little bit tricky, because the way this one's designed, it put the wireless NIC right up next to the edge of the laptop, and you have to do 2 sharp 90-degree bends on the antenna, and the antenna wires are a little bit stiff, so you kind of have to work them a little bit to get them to go in there correctly. I wish they would have moved that a little bit further in to make attaching the antennas easier. And the way that those things attach is there's 2 wires. There's one that has a white end on it and one that has a black end on it, and they attach to 2 essentially snaps that are very small on the wireless NIC. And so once you get those snapped on there, and you have to get the cables routed correctly, and then once they're in there, you can put the back on the back panel, and then put the screws back in, which I'm not going to show you how to do that. I'm sure you can figure that out. And then once you have the back panel on, you can replace the battery, which is simply just snaps right in. And with that, you can take the power cord and plug it in, and then you can open this guy up and fire it up. And if everything goes well, you should be seeing a boot screen that will indicate that, you know, more or less everything is working. No beeps, no other things like that. Here are the benchmarks that I have for this particular build. I don't put a lot of stock in benchmarks because they are a relative score that shows you just raw throughput for whatever component it's benchmarking, as it compares against other components or similar to it. However, my concern is just, does it perform well for my needs? But for the interested parties, I did use User Benchmark and then use that software to benchmark mine, and it turned out to be a fairly decent build, considering that I didn't do any kind of overclocking. It's just bone stock performance as it was when I booted it up and after I installed Windows and ran the benchmarks. So can you build a custom laptop? Yes, you can. It's really not that hard to do if you source your components correctly. With mine, it was not a very arduous process to do. It's mostly just doing the research and making sure that I had everything done right, and everything that I was going to install it would be supported by the base model that I bought, the bare bones laptop. And in doing so, I was able to save a couple $100 and have the satisfaction of building my own laptop. So there you have it. Thanks for watching this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.